Somewhere in eastern Oregon right now, a fire that started in ankle-high grass 11 days ago is still growing, and nobody can stop it. Not because firefighters aren't trying, because the wind won't let them. It has already burned more than 500,000 acres, and it is still moving, still eating ground, still the largest fire currently burning anywhere in the United States. 2,000 miles away, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, something else is happening at the exact same time, something that is supposed to be the cure for exactly this kind of disaster. A massive El Niño is building, the biggest one in a decade. It is strengthening faster than almost anyone predicted, and every forecaster who studies this pattern for a living knows what it usually means. It means rain. It means storm after storm rolling across the southern half of the country all winter long. It means drought eventually breaks. So here's the part that should not be possible. In the same week that ocean posted its biggest jump of the entire year, the United States drought map got worse. Not better, worse. Severe drought did not shrink, it expanded. And that is not a typo, and it is not a glitch in the data. It is something far stranger and far more dangerous than a bad forecast. Because the worst drought disaster this country has ever lived through was not caused by a powerful ocean event either. It was caused by a weak one that landed on ground that had already been ruined. And if that sentence makes you uneasy, it should, because we may be watching the opening chapter of the same story happen again in real time, right now. Stay with me, because to understand how nearly a third of this country can be sitting in severe drought while the very ocean pattern that is supposed to rescue it is heating up faster than it has in 10 years, you have to go back one winter. Back to a season that looked completely normal on the surface and quietly failed at the one job it had. Most people think of snow as scenery, something pretty on a mountain that melts away and is forgotten. In the American West, snow is not scenery. It is infrastructure. It is the largest reservoir system in the country. And nobody built it, nobody maintains it, and it costs nothing, because the mountains do it themselves every single year between November and March. That snowpack sits high in the peaks all winter, and then, as spring turns to summer, it releases slowly, feeding rivers, filling irrigation canals, keeping cattle troughs full from May clear through September. A region can survive one dry summer. It has survived plenty. What a region cannot survive is a summer that starts with an empty reservoir already sitting in the mountains before the heat even arrives. And that is precisely what happened. The winter that just passed was one of the warmest ever recorded in the Pacific Northwest. The snow that did fall came in wet and heavy instead of dry and deep, and it melted off early, weeks ahead of schedule. In some mountain basins, meaningful snowpack never really built up at all. This alone would be a problem. But this did not happen to healthy ground. It happened on top of years of stacked deficits, one dry season after another, each one drawing the soil moisture down a little further, each spring starting from a lower baseline than the one before it. Here's the thing about drought that almost nobody explains correctly. Drought is not simply a shortage of rain. That makes it sound passive, like something that just shows up one day. Drought is a debt. Every dry season borrows against water that is stored underground, in the soil, in the aquifers, in the mountain snow, and like any debt, a place can carry it quietly for years. It can look completely normal from the highway, green enough, fine enough, right up until the exact year the account finally comes up empty and there is nothing left to draw on. By the time spring rolled around, the ground across huge stretches of the Pacific Northwest was loaded. It was a weapon that simply had not gone off yet. And then the declarations started. 1 county, then 3, then 6. Within a matter of weeks, the state's governor had extended emergency drought declarations across nearly 24 counties. By early July, more than half the counties in the state were under a formal drought emergency, and somewhere close to 90% of the entire state was sitting in some level of drought. The neighboring states did not fare any better. 2 of them went all the way and declared statewide drought emergencies, covering every single county within their borders. Numbers like that are easy to skim past on a screen. They are much harder to skim past on the ground. Ranchers were driving water out to their own cattle in trucks, not to irrigate a single crop, just to give the animals something to drink because the creeks and springs they normally relied on had gone bone dry. Hay yields were coming in low across the board, which drove feed prices up, which meant some ranching families who had spent decades building their herds were now being forced to sell them down just to survive the season. In the central part of the state, hundreds of farmers were staring down water cutoffs as the region's main river ran roughly a third below where it should have been. Further south, growers were literally being paid to leave their fields empty for the year, and water regulators were saying out loud, on the record, that some irrigators would be shut off completely before the growing season even finished. None of this was a surprise to the people living through it. Everyone there could see exactly what was needed to fix it. One good wet winter. And out in the middle of the Pacific, something that looked exactly like a wet winter was assembling. There's a narrow strip of ocean along the equator in the central Pacific that climate scientists watch more closely than almost anywhere else on the planet. Because what happens there reaches all the way to farms in Oregon and reservoirs in California months later. Scientists track the temperature of that strip against its long-term average, smoothed out over rolling 3-month windows so a single unusually warm week can't fake a signal that isn't really there. When that number runs cold, you get La Niña. When it runs warm, you get El Niño. And the sequence that ocean produced over the first half of this year was not the shape these events normally take. The winter before, that number sat just below zero, cool and neutral, closer to La Niña territory than anything else. Within a few months, it had crossed well above zero. A few months after that, it had roughly doubled again. By the most recent reading, it had climbed even further, meaning the ocean had swung nearly 2 full degrees Celsius across a handful of overlapping seasons. And the size of each jump between readings was not shrinking the way these events are supposed to shrink as they mature through the warmer months. It was holding steady, powerful, refusing to slow down. There's a reason almost nobody trusted this signal while it was actually happening. Every single spring, the science of forecasting these ocean events runs into what meteorologists themselves call the spring predictability barrier, a stretch of months where the standard forecasting models essentially stop being reliable because tiny early errors get amplified into completely useless long-range output. All through that window this year, a lot of expert commentary waved this developing signal away for exactly that reason, said it was too early to trust, said the models couldn't be believed yet. The forecasters who got it right did something different. They stopped looking at the models entirely. Instead, they watched the physical reality underneath the surface, the sheer volume of unusually warm water stacking up far below the surface in the western Pacific, and the bursts of westerly wind physically shoving that warm water east along the equator, toward the coast, toward us. Models are guidance. That subsurface heat is something you can actually measure with your hands, so to speak. And when the two disagreed through that unreliable spring window, the water won. So here is what a powerful El Niño is actually supposed to do to this country, and why every drought map gets read completely differently once one is officially confirmed. The warm water itself never reaches North America directly. What reaches us is a chain reaction. The heat difference running east to west across that stretch of ocean drives massive circulation patterns of rising and sinking air across the entire tropics. Shift that temperature contrast, and the belt of enormous tropical thunderstorms slides thousands of miles east, and that shift pushes directly on the jet stream, the high-altitude river of air that essentially decides where winter storms go and how long they linger once they get there. In a strong El Niño winter, the southern branch of that jet stream strengthens and drives directly across the southern United States. California gets hammered with storm after storm. The Gulf Coast and the entire southeast turn wet. Reservoirs that have been drawn down for years start climbing again, and mountain snowpack that failed completely the year before can come roaring back in a single winter. And the forecast for this coming winter pointed at exactly that outcome. Nearly every major forecasting model held El Niño conditions through the entire winter forecast period, with the event expected to peak deep into the season. The overwhelming majority of those models placed the Central Pacific well above the threshold used to classify a truly powerful, very strong event. The official alert status sat at an advisory level, with forecasters putting the odds above 90% that this event would still be running well into next spring. And critically, the atmosphere had already engaged with the ocean signal, which is the piece that actually matters most, because an ocean can warm up on its own and the sky can simply fail to respond to it. That did not happen here. The sky was answering, which makes what happened in the first week of August genuinely difficult to look at. Every single week, the National Drought Monitor is published describing conditions exactly as they stood a few mornings earlier. The most recent map available described just under half of the entire continental United States as sitting in some form of drought. More specifically, close to 30% of the country was sitting in severe drought or worse. That second number is the one that actually matters, and the reason it matters is the direction it was moving. Severe drought coverage did not shrink that week, even as El Niño strengthened. It grew, and it grew during the exact same 7-day stretch in which the ocean posted the single largest temperature jump it had recorded all year. 1/4 percentage point sounds like nothing. It is not nothing, because that national number is an average sitting on top of an entire country that is quietly pulling apart underneath it. The eastern half of the country genuinely improved that week. The Central Plains improved. The upper Midwest improved. And, at the exact same time, the Northwest kept getting worse. The northern plains got worse again. The southern plains started sliding for the first time all year. The national number barely moved because the country was being pulled in 2 completely opposite directions simultaneously. And this is where the actual explanation lives, and it is not a comfortable one. El Niño's relief is never distributed evenly across the map. It is aimed like a hose pointed at one half of a lawn, the exact same atmospheric pattern that soaks California and the desert Southwest, and the entire Gulf Coast is the exact same pattern that runs dry and unusually warm across the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Rockies, the Northern Plains, and much of the upper Midwest. Those regions are never neutral bystanders in a strong El Niño winter. They sit on the losing side of it by design, which means the single strongest El Niño to assemble in a decade is arriving as genuine rescue for a country whose worst hit region happens to sit squarely inside the half of the map that pattern makes drier, not wetter. The forecast is not wrong. The relief is completely real. It is simply pointed at the wrong address. By the middle of this month, that piece of arithmetic has stopped being abstract because in eastern Oregon, it is on fire and has been for 11 straight days. The fire burning near the Idaho line was discovered in late July with no clear cause beyond natural ignition. And by the most recent federal listing, it covers more than 550,000 acres. It is the single largest active incident on the entire National Fire List, with well over 1,000 personnel assigned under a full complex incident management structure. And the fuel type explains almost everything about why this fire is behaving the way it is. It is short grass, barely a foot tall in most places. Grass fires do not build the way a timber fire builds, slowly, methodically, climbing tree by tree. They run. Under wind, across cured grass with zero remaining moisture in it, a fire front can move at essentially the speed of the wind pushing it. In the most recent reporting period alone, this single fire grew by roughly 13,000 acres, and its containment did not hold at the level crews had fought to reach. It actually fell backward. A fire that is simultaneously growing in size and losing containment percentage is a fire that is beating the people assigned to stop it in both directions at once. The largest wildfire ever recorded in that state's history sits at roughly 557,000 acres. This fire is sitting only a few thousand acres beneath that all-time record, and it has covered thousands of acres in a single afternoon more than once during this incident already, and it is nowhere close to alone. Two other fires in the same state have each burned past 300,000 acres on their own. Across the state line, another major fire is sitting at over 100,000 acres and barely 2% contained, which at that scale is not meaningfully contained at all. In a single 24-hour window recently, satellite instruments detected close to 4,000 separate active fire hotspots scattered across the country. That state alone has now burned past 2.3 million acres for the season. This is what a drought stops being a line on a map and starts being something else entirely. There's a reason to take a number like this seriously instead of simply waiting it out and hoping the rain arrives on schedule, and it is not a hunch or a gut feeling. It is the single best documented catastrophe in the history of American land, and it began in almost exactly this same quiet way, decades ago. In the early 1930s, drought settled across the southern Great Plains, the Panhandle regions, the high plains stretching across several states, and it did not lift. It held on in overlapping waves for most of an entire decade. What actually made that region so catastrophically vulnerable was never simply the weather. For thousands of years before that, the southern plains had been held together by dense native grassland, a thick root system that anchored a fine, high silica soil against constant, relentless wind. Through the 1910s and 20s, driven by high wheat prices and a wave of new mechanized tractors, farmers tore up that grassland across millions upon millions of acres. The wheat grew beautifully for a while. Then the rain simply stopped coming, the wheat failed completely, and what remained was several million acres of loose, pulverized dirt with absolutely nothing left holding it to the ground, and nothing above it but open wind. The storms started and got measurably worse every single year that followed. At one point, a single storm lifted soil directly off those plains and carried it far enough east to darken the sky over major cities hundreds of miles away and to drop plains dirt on the decks of ships sitting out in the open ocean. Farmers were losing entire fields to the open sky, and that same soil was landing on rooftops 1,000 miles from where it started. And that was not even the worst storm. The worst one came the following spring, and it arrived on what looked like the most beautiful day of the season. Picture a clear, warm, still Sunday morning. After weeks of blowing dirt, the air that particular morning is unusually clean. Families across the region go to church. Women hang laundry outside for the first time in weeks. Windows get opened. Children who had been kept indoors for days finally get sent outside to play. And then, without warning, a fast-moving storm front begins racing south out of the plains, hundreds of miles to the north. As it crosses the exposed, unprotected ground beneath it, it begins picking up everything loose in its path. What it builds as it travels is not simply a cloud of dust. It is a wall, a rolling black front of solid earth that witnesses at the time, and official weather records afterward, describe as rising somewhere between 500 and 600 feet into the sky, and higher in some places, black at its base and a deep reddish brown at its crown, moving steadily south across an entire chain of states. People saw it coming from miles away and genuinely could not process what they were looking at. Some thought it was simply a rain cloud finally arriving and felt real relief for the first time in months. Others thought the world itself was ending and said so afterward without any embarrassment at all. And then it arrived, and the day simply went out. Not dimmed, went out. Every single account from every affected town describes the exact same detail. The transition from full afternoon daylight to complete, total darkness took only minutes, and inside that darkness, a person could not see their own hand held directly in front of their face. Drivers stopped wherever they happened to be because the road itself had disappeared. Static electricity generated by the sheer volume of moving dirt shorted out car engines on the spot and knocked grown men flat on their backs when they reached for a simple metal doorknob. Families sitting inside farmhouses pressed wet cloth over their children's faces and simply waited in total darkness for something that had almost no sound to it at all beyond the wind. A wire service reporter traveling through the region that week filed a dispatch describing residents marking up yet another black duster. That single phrase became the name given to the entire decade, and it is the name we still use today, generations later. The dust that fell across the southern plains that year was never ordinary dirt. It had been pulverized down to a fineness smaller than the period at the end of a printed sentence, and it carried an extremely high silica content, and silica sitting in a human lung does not dissolve and does not ever leave. Breathed in month after month, it produced a form of lung disease clinically comparable to the black lung disease that was already killing coal miners on the other side of the country. People at the time simply called it dust pneumonia. The people it killed most efficiently were, without exception, the very young and the very old. A medical emergency was formally declared that same year, and emergency hospitals were opened across 3 separate states. Some of those hospitals had to be set up inside school gymnasiums that had to be physically sealed against the dust before a single patient could safely be brought inside. Hospitals that had to be made airtight against the weather itself in order to treat people that same weather had already injured. Tens of thousands of gauze masks were handed out to schoolchildren across the region. Most of those masks plugged completely solid with dirt within about an hour of being worn. Roughly 10 days after that one storm, officials in a single state alone reported over a dozen deaths directly from dust pneumonia and several more from outright dust suffocation. Across the full length of the era, the commonly cited death toll from dust pneumonia alone runs into the thousands, a number that accumulated one household at a time year after year, in a way that never produced a single dramatic headline day anyone could point back to later. Somewhere close to 2.5 million people ultimately left the Plain States during that decade. It remains one of the largest single internal migrations in American history, and the overwhelming majority of the people swept up in it were never fleeing one specific storm. They were leaving ground that no longer produced anything at all, carrying whatever fit into the family car. 5 days after that storm, a soil scientist walked into a Senate office building in Washington to testify before a congressional committee on public land. He had been making the exact same argument for years to anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear it. American topsoil was actively being destroyed. That destruction was permanent on any human timescale that mattered, and only the federal government had the resources and the reach to actually stop it. He had been correct for the better part of a decade, and for the better part of a decade, Congress had done essentially nothing about it. He walked into that hearing room that particular morning already knowing something the committee sitting in front of him did not know yet. He had been tracking a massive dust storm moving steadily east off the plains, and he had a fairly precise idea of roughly when it would reach the Capitol, so he stalled. He drew out every answer longer than it needed to be. He circled back to points he had already made minutes earlier. He kept those senators sitting in that room while the light coming through the windows behind him slowly shifted from ordinary spring daylight into a strange, unsettling copper color, and then kept talking as that copper color deepened further, and then finally went out completely. When the room had gone fully dark in the middle of a weekday afternoon, he simply gestured toward the window behind him and said the single line that ended the entire argument on the spot. "This, gentlemen, is what I have been trying to tell you about." 8 days later, the president signed federal soil conservation legislation into law. It created a permanent federal agency dedicated entirely to the problem, and the man who had staged that hearing was put directly in charge of running it. What followed over the coming years was contour plowing and terracing and structured crop rotation and deliberate cover cropping and a massive federal shelter belt program that eventually put more than 200 million trees into the ground across the plains, specifically to break the force of the wind before it could pick anything up. And it worked. When droughts of genuinely comparable meteorological severity returned in the following decades, the soil largely stayed exactly where it belonged. The lesson had been learned at enormous human cost, and it had finally been paid for with real policy. here's the part that reaches all the way forward to right now, and it does not come from storytelling. It comes directly from published science. Back in the early 2000s, a team of researchers using satellite and ocean data reproduced that entire decade-long drought inside a climate model using nothing but historical sea surface temperatures as an input. A cooler than normal tropical Pacific, paired with a warmer than normal tropical Atlantic, sustained across nearly a full decade, was enough on its own to recreate the broad shape of that disaster. The single worst environmental catastrophe in American history was, in large part, manufactured by an ocean pattern thousands of miles away from the actual ground it went on to destroy. The people living on the southern plains never got a vote in the matter, but the model did not reproduce every detail perfectly. The real disaster on the ground turned out to be more severe than the ocean signal alone could fully account for, and it was centered slightly differently than the pure ocean model predicted. A follow-up study published several years later found the missing piece. You have to add the land itself back into the equation, add the stripped, exposed ground, and the dust that ground was actively throwing back up into the atmosphere once it started moving. And the simulated drought in the model deepens further and shifts location, and it finally matches what actually happened on the ground almost exactly. The ocean started it, the exposed ground finished it, and there is one more detail buried in that original study that is worth sitting with for a moment. The researchers themselves described the tropical Pacific Ocean anomaly that drove the entire 1930s disaster as, in their own words, surprisingly weak. The single worst drought disaster in the history of the United States was never launched by some record-breaking, unprecedented ocean event. It was launched by a genuinely modest one, landing squarely on ground that had already been made ready to fail. None of this means we are watching an exact replay of the 1930s unfold in real time. We are not, and the real differences matter, and they deserve to be said honestly rather than buried for the sake of a scarier ending. The soil conservation practices that scientists fought so hard for are still in place across most of American farmland today, and they are still working exactly as intended. The forecast for the southern half of the country genuinely is good. A wet California, a wet southeast, heavy snow rebuilding in the Sierra Nevada by spring. Those honest weaknesses in the parallel cut both directions, and they absolutely belong in the record alongside everything else. The Western Pacific near Australia is not running nearly as cool this time as it was during the last truly comparable event decades ago, and it is the temperature contrast across the entire ocean basin that does the actual work here, not the raw number by itself, which means a record-breaking ocean reading this year may not automatically translate into record-breaking consequences on the ground. And the last genuinely strong El Niño, roughly a decade ago, actually failed to verify in the Pacific Northwest at all. That particular winter came in unusually wet against nearly every model's composite expectation going in. So there is real documented precedent for this exact pattern breaking the other way. Quietly, without incident, without headlines. What the 1930s actually argue, when you strip away everything else, is narrower than a simple doomsday prediction, and it is far harder to simply dismiss and move on from. The ocean sets the odds. The condition of the ground decides the actual outcome. And the ground has always been where the real leverage sits, long before the first storm ever forms out over open water. The reason the southern plains eventually became productive farmland again after that decade was never conservation practice alone. It was also a massive underground aquifer, and the irrigation infrastructure built to reach deep into it. Water that had been slowly banked over thousands of years, spent all at once to make a semi-arid region productive again within a single human generation. That account is being drawn down right now, in real time, faster than it is being refilled, in exactly the same region that nearly collapsed once already. The engineering solution to the last disaster was, in a very real sense, simply a different kind of withdrawal from a different kind of account. So when close to a third of this entire country is sitting in severe drought, and that number keeps growing during the single steepest week of ocean warming recorded all year, while the largest active wildfire in the entire nation keeps gaining ground and simultaneously losing containment in that exact same week. The actually useful response is not to sit back and simply wait for the rain the forecast keeps promising. The useful response is to look closely at exactly which half of the map that promised rain is actually aimed at, and to remember, clearly and without flinching, that the last time this country came within a hair's breadth of permanently losing an entire region, the ocean signal sitting behind it was, by the scientists' own account, weak.